All right, everyone, get ready because today we're going deep, deep into a story chosen just for you guys. And that story is the unsettling case of Clifton Ray Jr., a serial killer who really left his mark on Kansas City. Now, you may have heard his name before, but what's truly crazy about this guy is that he was so close to getting away with it all. He was actually days away from walking free, already in prison for murder, but they were going to parole him. That's when DNA technology stepped in and changed everything.
It really is a story where science and justice collide. You're going to see in the research how DNA testing, which was pretty new back in the 90s, became the key to cracking Ray's case wide open and making sure he stayed behind bars.
That's right, and we've got a ton of articles and court records to dig through today, and believe me, it gets pretty intense. But we're not just here to rehash the headlines, are we? We're going way beyond that. We're going to examine Clifton Ray's life, the patterns in his crimes, and how those breakthroughs in DNA brought justice to the victims and their families.
It's crucial to remember that the victims in this case weren't just names in a police report. They were real people, mothers, sons, daughters, each with their own lives and families who were deeply impacted by Ray's actions.
Absolutely, and we won't forget that as we go through this. So everyone has his background information. Let's start by taking a look at Clifton Ray's early life. On the surface, it seems pretty average. Grew up working class in Kansas City, went to church, played Little League, even joined the Marines. You wouldn't exactly look at that and think a serial killer, would you?
That's what makes this case so disturbing. There are these flashes of normalcy, but then when you look closer, you start seeing these red flags popping up throughout his life. I mean, even as early as 1979. There's a rape arrest charges were dropped, though, then a purse snatching charge, and then multiple arrests for various offenses.
It's almost as if he was pushing the limits, seeing just how much he could get away with, right? And sadly, based on what we've got here, it seems like he got away with a lot for a long, long time. But everything takes a very, very dark turn when Ray moves into the Royal Towers apartment.
It's right, the Royal Towers become the central point for his crimes. A chilling pattern emerges. Ray moves in, and not long after, people start turning up dead.
The first victim is Ernest Taylor, found stabbed to death in his own apartment. Ray was charged with second-degree murder. But get this, the charges were dismissed. And there's even evidence in our research that shows Ray sold Taylor's TV at a pawn shop. I mean, how did they let him go?
It's a question that haunts this case, especially with what happens next. Just weeks later, Leroy Hightower, a Vietnam vet and a retired KC police officer, is found dead in his apartment.
Hold on, a retired police officer. This guy's getting bold.
Exactly. Now, they couldn't determine Hightower's cause of death because, well, the body was too decomposed. But his death makes this story even more complex.
And it doesn't stop there. The body count at Royal Towers keeps rising. A few months later, Mia Smith, found strangled in the stairway. The police were suspicious of Ray. But again, no charges. It's like this violence is escalating right in front of everyone.
The brutality is definitely getting worse with each victim. Then, on April 27, 1994, we get the murder that finally puts Clifton Ray in prison.
Bobby J. Robertson found strangled in his apartment. That's the one that finally sticks, right? But here's where it gets really, really messed up. He was actually about to be paroled for that murder. Imagine that. They were going to let this guy walk free, back onto the streets. He could have hurt who knows how many more people.
Yeah, it sends chills down your spine just thinking about it. It really does. And it shows how crucial the advancements in DNA technology were in this case. I mean, while Ray was serving time for Robertson's murder, there were still all those unsolved cases from years before. Cases that, thanks to science, they were finally able to connect to him.
Right, so let's rewind a bit, even before those Royal Towers murders. Our research outlines the case of Deborah D. Taylor, a mother of two and a college student. Tragically, she was found strangled to death on December 11, 1987, left in a vacant field. Now, they actually suspected Ray back then, but there just wasn't enough evidence to charge him.
This is where DNA testing really changes the game. In the early 90s, this technology was really starting to take hold in law enforcement. Imagine you have this tiny, tiny sample of genetic material, and from that, you can identify a person with incredible accuracy.
So, break this down for me, Letty. How does this DNA testing actually work? It sounds like something out of science fiction, but it's what really put Ray away.
Think of DNA as like a blueprint, totally unique to each person. So forensic scientists, they can compare DNA profiles from crime scenes to samples from suspects, or even to databases of convicted offenders. And in Deborah Taylor's case, the DNA they found on her body, they were finally able to match it to Clifton Ray in 2003. That was huge, a real turning point.
Wow, so even after all those years, the evidence was still there, just waiting for the right technology to come along. It's like science finally caught up to him.
Exactly, and it wasn't just Deborah Taylor's case. We also have the murder of Joycey Flowers on May 24, 1990, right? She was 41 years old, a mother of four, Sunday school teacher, choir director, a real pillar of her community.
And another victim of Clifton Ray. It's just heartbreaking that someone who brought so much good to everyone around her could meet such a tragic end.
Her case, like Deborah Taylor's, was a mystery at first. But remember that DNA evidence I mentioned? Well, they tested the semen found at Joycey Flowers' murder scene. And you know what? It matched Clifton Ray's DNA.
Okay, so we've got him already in prison for Robertson's murder. And now DNA evidence links him to 2 more murders that happened years before. But if he was already convicted, how on earth were they about to let him out on parole?
It almost doesn't make sense, does it? But the parole board at that time, they didn't know about those ongoing DNA investigations. They were only looking at the Robertson case on its own. They had no idea about the potential scope of Ray's crimes.
So they almost released a serial killer. That's where this story gets really intense.
It was a race against time, it really was. The investigators working those Taylor and Flowers cases, they knew they had to get those DNA results confirmed and presented before Ray walked out of those prison doors.
Wow, what a close call. So did they stop him in time?
It was down to the wire, but yes, they did. They managed to stop him. Those DNA results came back just in time. The parole board, they were given that undeniable evidence linking Ray to 2 more murders, and thankfully they did the right thing.
Thank goodness for that. So they finally had enough to keep him locked up for good.
Absolutely. Convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Deborah Taylor and Joycey Flowers, he'll never have the chance to hurt another innocent person. I think this case really drives home the point of how vital these scientific advances are in solving crimes.
It really is a case of justice for failing. Even after all those years, he thought he'd gotten away with it. But then science comes back to haunt him. But even with those convictions, we're left with more questions, aren't we? We talked earlier about those suspicious deaths at the Royal Towers apartments. Those deaths at the Royal Towers, right? They never really closed the book on those. And looking at everything we've talked about today, you have to wonder, could there be more victims out there that we don't even know about?
Yeah, it's a chilling thought. It really hung in question. And sadly, we might never know the true extent of Clifton Ray's crimes. Those Royal Towers cases, they're still open, still shrouded in all this suspicion and mystery. But I think what we can learn from this, what's really important for everyone listening, is to understand the broader impact of these crimes, right? We've talked about the victims, the families, how science played a role in solving the case. But there's another layer here that we need to think about: the ripple effect these crimes had on the entire community.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the investigation. And forget about the human cost, the families left behind, the fear that must have just gripped those Royal Towers residents.
Yeah, can you imagine? Living in that building, knowing that people were being murdered around you, and the killer was still out there. That vulnerability, the loss of trust, those scars run deep and take a long time to heal.
It makes you realize that these cases, these stories, they're not just isolated incidents. They affect entire communities, leave everyone feeling uneasy, uncertain.
And it raises some tough questions about how we as a society respond to these kinds of things, doesn't it? How do we support the families who are hurting? How do we work to prevent these crimes from happening again? How do we find that balance between seeking justice and showing compassion? These are big questions that go way beyond just this one case.
So we've gone from this seemingly normal upbringing to a string of brutal crimes. It almost gets paroled. Can you review that? But in the end, justice is served, all thanks to DNA technology. It's been a wild ride, for sure. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around how someone like Clifton Ray, how someone could go down that path. What do you think? What makes a serial killer?
Oh, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no simple answer. Experts have been studying serial killers for decades, looking for patterns, explanations, anything to make sense of it all. But it often comes down to a really complex mix of factors. Genetics, how they were raised, trauma, maybe mental illness. It's complicated.
So there's no one single cause. It's like a whole bunch of different threads weaving together and pushing someone down this dark path.
Exactly. And with Ray, we saw those early warning signs, right? Those arrests, charges being dropped. Makes you wonder, what if someone had intervened early on? Do you think things could have been different? Could his life have gone in another direction?
We'll never know for sure. But it does make you think. Maybe if the system had recognized those red flags, maybe those tragedies could have been prevented.
Yeah, that's a really important point to think about. But it also shows how challenging this all is. Figuring out who's at risk, giving them the right kind of support, finding that balance between protecting individual rights and keeping the public safe. Those are tough questions with no easy answers.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and crimes of Clifton Ray Jr., we're left with more than just the facts of the case. We're left with this understanding of the deep, lasting impact these crimes have, not just on the victims and their families, but on the entire community. And we're left with this responsibility to learn from what happened, to keep asking the tough questions, and to work towards a future where tragedies like these are less likely to happen.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Clifton Ray's story reminds us that behind every headline, every court case, there are real lives that are forever changed. And that's something that should stay with all of us. It should make us think critically about these complex issues, crime, justice, and what it means to be human.